and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and you are watching Varietal Literature's YouTube page. We're also a website, varietal-literature.ca, where we do poem, story, nonfiction, fiction, and even choose your own adventures for a more grown-up crowd on that very website from a group of Vancouver writers. And what we do here is we have fun with narrative. And the way we're having fun with narrative tonight is what we do every Tuesday night, which is we're going to read old folk and fairy tales, sort of the roots of stories. And then we are going to read some more. What we're going to read tonight is a series of stories that I actually originally found in a book that I got for my birthday last week called Nordic Tales. Now you'll notice it's a fairly new book. It's got some very nice art. I will let you admire that. Which you might say, okay, Rory, what about the copyrights? So all the stories in it are public domain. And so we're going to read the original public domain sources. But I do want to show, like, okay, if I can get these public domain stories for free, why would I even buy it? And this is your answer. This is a picture for the story that we're going to read next. First, which is the namesake of the title, which is, of course, from the book Mighty Mikko, a book of Finnish fairy tales and folk tales. And it is a story called The Forest Bride. And we are going to we're going to read The Forest Bride first. It's probably about 10 or 15 minute read. We'll see. Sometimes I'm wrong on that. And then we're going to read another one from that same original source. They're all from this book, ultimately. But from the same original source, which is Mighty Mikko. Pardon me. The story, Mighty Mikko, which actually is going to be one that the structure of which should sound familiar if you were watching this month. Because it's very similar to another story. And then the last story we're going to read is actually from a different original source, but that same book, called The Way of the World. It's from a book called Tales from Fjeld. So we're going to read three stories. One's about a mouse bride. One is about Mighty Mikko, which carries a lot of... Oh, the fox returns, let's say that. The fox character we talked about earlier this month comes back in this. A completely different book, though. And then the way of the World is a shorter story, but one of the few that we've read that have dragons in it. So that one I like. GS says they're all public domain. How awesome. And also good evening, GS. Yeah, they're all public domain. As all the tales we read on here are public domain, which is a wonderful pool of knowledge and information you can take and reinvent if you're a writer. Or if you aspire to doing some writing, one fun thing to do is to take the stories that we read here and reinvent them to better reflect your time or your life or your imagination. I mean, that's the whole damn point of public domain. It's one of the reasons, which I've never actually literally said on there, but it's one of the reasons why I do it. These readings is I want to remind people that there is a whole pool of stories to draw from, and if you're a creative person and you're looking for inspiration for art or stories or poems, this is stuff that is there for the taking. They are stories of well, I mean, in many cases my cultural history, maybe not yours exactly, but they're there for our society to pick apart and put into new stuff. It's the vibrant life cycle of art. Okay. Well, it wouldn't be a Fireside Fairytales if I didn't get myself off into a philosophical tangent. Off the bat. If you are watching this later, so if you're not watching it live, there will be timestamps down in the description below for the three stories we're going to read today. So we may as well get to the first story. And the first story comes from the book Mighty Mikko, a book of Finnish fairy tales and folk tales. Originally, though you can also find it in Nordic Tales. And it is called The Forest Bride. It has a sub-name that I'm actually not going to give you right now because I feel like it gives too much of the story away. There was once a farmer who had 3 sons, and one day when the boys were grown to manhood, he said to them, "My sons, it is high time that you are all married. Tomorrow I wish to you to go out in search of brides." "But where shall we go?" the oldest son asked. "I have thought of that too," the father said. "Do each of you chop down a tree, then take the direction in which the fallen tree points. I'm sure that each of you, if you go far enough in that direction, will find a suitable bride." So the next day the 3 sons chopped down trees. The oldest son's tree fell pointing north. "That suits me," he said, for he knew that to the north lay a farm where a very pretty girl lived. The tree of the second son, when it fell, pointed south. "That suits me," the second son declared, thinking of a girl that he had often danced with, who lived on a farm to the south. The youngest son's tree, the youngest son's name was Varietal, when it fell, pointed straight to the forest. "Ha ha!" the older brothers laughed. "Varietal, we'll have to go courting one of the wolf girls, or one of the foxes." They meant by this that only animals lived in the forest, and they thought they were making a good joke at Varietal's expense. But Varietal said he was perfectly willing to take his chances and go where his tree pointed. The older brothers went gaily off, presented their suits to the 2 farmers whose daughters they admired. Varietal, too, started off with brave front, but after he'd gone some distance in the forest, his courage began to ebb. "How can I find a bride?" he asked himself, "in a place where there are no human creatures at all?" Just then he came to a little hut. He pushed open the door and went in. It was empty. To be sure, there was a little mouse sitting on the table, daintily combing her whiskers. But a mouse, of course, doesn't count. Anticipating a voice here. "There's nobody here," Varietal said aloud. The little mouse paused in her toilet, turning towards him, and said reproachfully, "Why, Varietal, I'm here." We'll do better. I have a bit of a catch in my throat. It's not letting me go as high as I want. "But you don't count. You're only a mouse." "Of course I count," the little mouse declared. "But tell me, what were you hoping to find?" "I was hoping to find a sweetheart." The little mouse questioned him further, and Varietal told her the whole story of his brothers in the trees. "The 2 older ones are finding sweethearts easily enough," Varietal said, "but I don't see how I came off here in the forest, and it will shame me to have to go home and confess that I alone have failed." "See here, Varietal," the little mouse said, "why don't you take me for your sweetheart?" Varietal laughed heartily. "But you're only a mouse. Who ever heard of a man having a mouse for a sweetheart?" The mouse took her little head solemnly. "Take my word for it, Varietal. You could do much worse than have me for a sweetheart. Even if I am only a mouse, I can love you and be true to you." She was a dear, dainty little mouse as she sat looking up at Varietal with her little paws under her chin and her bright little eyes sparkling. Varietal liked her more and more. Then she sang Varietal a pretty little song, and the song cheered him so much that he forgot his disappointment at not finding a human sweetheart. As he left her to go home, he said, "Very well, little mouse. I'll take you for my sweetheart." At that, the mouse made little squeaks of delight, and she told him that she'd be true to him and wait for him no matter how long he was in returning. Well, the older brothers, when they got home, boasted loudly about their sweethearts. "Mine," said the oldest, "has the rosiest, reddest cheeks you ever saw." "And mine," the second announced, "has long, yellow hair." Varietal said nothing. "What's the matter, Varietal?" the older brothers asked him, laughing. "Has your sweetheart pretty pointed ears and sharp white teeth?" You see, they were still having their little joke about foxes and wolves. "You needn't laugh," Varietal said. "I've found a sweetheart. She's a gentle, dainty little thing gowned in velvet." Gowned in velvet, echoed the oldest brother with a frown. Just like a princess, the second brother sneered. Yes, Veiko repeated. Gowned in velvet like a princess. And when she sits up, she sings to me, and I'm perfectly happy. Huh, grunted the older brothers, not at all pleased that Veiko should have so grand a sweetheart. Well, said the old farmer after a few days, now I should like to know what all those sweethearts of yours are able to do. Have them each bake me a loaf of bread, so that I can see whether they're good housewives. Mine will be able to bake bread, I'm sure of that, the oldest brother declared boastfully. So will mine, chorused the second brother. Veiko was silent. What about the princess? They said with a laugh. Do you think the princess can bake bread? I don't know, Veiko answered truthfully. I'll have to ask her. Of course, he had no reason for supposing that the little mouse could bake bread, and by the time he reached the hut in the forest, he was feeling sad and discouraged. When he pushed open the door, he found the little mouse, as before, seated on the table, daintily combing her whiskers. At the sight of Veiko, she danced about with delight. I'm so glad to see you, she squeaked. I knew you would come back. Then, when she noticed that he was silent, she asked him what was the matter. Veiko told her. My father wants each of our sweethearts to bake him a loaf of bread. If I come home with a loaf, my brothers will laugh at me. Without a loaf. You won't have to go home without a loaf, the little mouse said. I can bake bread. Veiko was much surprised at this. I've never heard of a mouse that could bake bread. Well, I can, the little mouse insisted. With that, she began ringing a small silver bell. Ding, 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 ding. Instantly, there was the sound of hurrying footsteps and tiny scratchy footsteps. And hundreds of mice came running into the hut. The little princess mouse, sitting up very straight and dignified, said to them, Each of you go fetch me a grain of the finest wheat. And all the mice scampered quickly away and soon returned one by one, each carrying a grain of the finest wheat. After that, it was no trick at all for the princess mouse to bake a beautiful loaf of wheaten bread. The next day, the three brothers presented their fathers the loaves of their sweethearts' baking. The oldest one had a loaf of rye bread. Very good, the farmer said. For hard work and people like us, rye bread is good. The loaf the second son had was made of barley. Barley bread is also good, the farmer said. Really dense, though. But when Veiko presented his loaf of beautiful wheaten bread, his father cried out, What? White bread? Ah, Veiko must have a sweetheart of wealth. Of course, the older brother sneered. Didn't he tell us it was a princess? Say, Veiko, when a princess wants fine white flour, how does she get it? Veiko answered simply. She rings a little silver bell, and when her servants come in, she tells them to bring her grains of the finest wheat. At this, the older brothers nearly exploded with envy until their father had to reprove them. There, he said. Don't grudge the boy his good luck. Each girl has baked the loaf she knows how to make, and each in her own way will probably make a good wife. But before you bring them home to me, I want one further test of their skill in housewifery. Let them each send me a sample of their weaving. The older brothers were delighted at this, for they knew that their sweethearts were skillful weavers. We'll see how her ladyship fares this time, they said, sure in their hearts that Veiko's sweetheart, whoever she was, would not put them to shame with her weaving. Veiko, too, had serious doubts of a little mouse's ability at the loom. Whoever heard of a mouse that could weave? He said to himself as he pushed open the door of the forest hut. Oh, there you are at last! The little mouse squeaked joyfully. She reached out her little paws in welcome, and then in her excitement she began dancing about the table. Are you really glad to see me, little mouse? Veiko said. Indeed I am, the mouse declared. Am I not your sweetheart? I've been waiting for you and waiting, just wishing that you would return. Does your father want something more this time, Veiko? Yes, and it's something I'm afraid you can't give me, little mouse. Perhaps I can. Tell me what it is. It's a sample of your weaving. I don't believe you can weave. I've never heard of a mouse that could weave. Tut tut, said the mouse. Of course I can weave. It would be a strange thing if Veiko's sweetheart couldn't weave. She rang the little silver bell. Dingle, 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 dingle. And instantly there was the faint scratch, scratch of 100 little feet as mice came running in from all directions and sat up on their haunches, awaiting their princess's orders. Go each of you, she said, and give me a fiber of flax, the finest there is. The mice went scurrying off, and soon they began returning one by one, each bringing a fiber of flax. When they had spun the flax and carded it, the little mouse wove a beautiful piece of fine linen. It was so sheer that she was able, when she folded it, to put it into an empty nutshell. Here, Veiko, she said, here in this little box is a sample of my weaving. I hope your father will like it. Veiko, when he got home, felt almost embarrassed, for he was sure that his sweetheart's weaving would shame his brothers, so at first he kept the nutshell hidden in his pocket. The sweetheart of the oldest brother had sent us, as a sample of her weaving, a square of coarse cotton. Not very fine, the farmer said, but good enough. The second brother's sample was a square of cotton and linen mixed. A little better, the farmer said, nodding his head. Then he turned to Veiko. And you, Veiko, how's your sweetheart not giving you a sample of her weaving? Veiko handed his father a nutshell, at sight of which his brothers burst out laughing. They laughed. Veiko's sweetheart gives him a nut when he asks for a sample of her weaving. But their laughter died as the farmer opened the nutshell and began shaking out a great web of the finest linen. Why, Veiko, my boy, he cried, well, however did your sweetheart get threads for so fine a web? Veiko answered modestly. She rang a little silver bell and ordered her servants to bring her in fibers of finest flax. They did so, and after they had spun the flax and carded it, my sweetheart wove the web you see. Wonderful, gasped the farmer. I've never known such a weaver. The other girls will be all right for farmers' wives, but Veiko's sweetheart might be a princess. Well, concluded the farmer, it's time that you all brought your sweethearts home. I want to see them with my own eyes. Suppose you bring them tomorrow. She's a good little mouse, and I'm very fond of her, Veiko thought to himself as he went out to the forest. But my brothers will certainly laugh when they find out she's only a mouse. Well, I don't care if they do laugh. She's been a good little sweetheart to me, and I'm not going to be ashamed of her. So when he got to the hut, he told the little mouse at once that his father wanted to see her. The little mouse was greatly excited. I must go in proper style, she said. She rang the little silver bell and ordered her coach and 5. The coach, when it came, turned out to be an empty nutshell, and the 5 prancing steeds that were drawing it were 5 black mice. The little mouse seated herself in the coach, with a coachman mouse on the box in front of her and a footman mouse on the box behind her. I would like to point out, though, it's, in this world, mice are like people, apparently. So there's a bit of a mix on this, but I'd like to point out that at this point in the story, for all you know, she just had a bunch of her servants being horses. This is like a person in a human-drawn cart. Oh, how my brothers will laugh, thought Veiko, but he didn't laugh. He walked beside the coach and told the mouse not to be frightened, and he would take good care of her. His father, he told her, was a gentle old man and would be kind to her. When they left the forest, they came to a river which was spanned by a footbridge. Just as Veiko and the nutshell coach had reached the middle of the bridge, a man met them coming from the opposite direction. "Mercy me!" the man exclaimed as he caught sight of the strange little coach that was rolling alongside Veiko. "What's that?" He stooped down and looked, and with a loud laugh he put his foot and pushed the coach and the little mouse and her servants and her 5 prancing steeds all off the bridge into the water below. "What have you done? What have you done?" Veiko cried. "You've drowned my poor little sweetheart." The man, thinking Veiko was crazy, hurried away. Veiko, with tears in his eyes, looked into the water. There's a nice little picture there for you. It's a little hard to see, but here, I'll do a little zoom. There you go. You can see the 5. "You poor little mouse," he said. "How sorry I am that you are drowned. You were a faithful, loving sweetheart, and now that you are gone, I know how much I loved you." And as he spoke, he saw a beautiful coach of gold drawn by 5 glossy horses go up the far bank of the river. A coachman in gold lace held the reins, and a footman in a pointed cap sat up stiffly behind. The most beautiful girl in the world was seated in the coach. Her skin was as red as a berry and as white as snow. Her long golden hair gleamed with jewels, and she was dressed in pearly velvet. She beckoned to Veiko, and when he came close, she said, "Won't you come sit beside me?" Me? Veiko stammered, too dazed to think. The beautiful creature smiled. "You were not ashamed to have me for a sweetheart when I was a mouse," she said, "and surely now that I am a princess again, you won't desert me." A mouse?" Veiko gasped. "You were the little mouse!" The princess nodded. "Yes, I was the little mouse under an evil enchantment which could never have been broken if you had not taken me as a sweetheart, and if another human being had not drowned me. Now the enchantment is forever broken, so come and we will go to your father. After he has given us his blessing, we will get married and go home to my kingdom." And that's exactly what they did. They drove at once to the farmer's house, and when Veiko's father and his brother's sweetheart saw the princess coach stopping at their gate, they all came out bowing and scraping to see such grand folk. What such grand folk could want of them. "Father," Veiko cried, "don't you know me?" The father stopped bowing long enough to look up. "Why, bless my soul," he cried, "it's our Veiko." "Yes, father, I'm Veiko, and this is the princess that I'm going to marry." "A princess, did you say, Veiko?" "Mercy me, where did a boy find a princess?" "Out in the forest where my tree pointed." Well, the farmer said. "Where your tree pointed? I've always heard that was a good way to find a bride." The oldest brothers shook their heads gloomily and muttered, "Just our luck. If only our trees had pointed to the forest, we too should have found princesses instead of plain country wenches." But they were wrong. It wasn't because his tree pointed to the forest that Veiko got the princess. It was because he was so simple and good that he was kind even to a little mouse. Well, after they had got the farmer's blessing, they rode home to the princess's kingdom and were married. And they were happy as they should have been, for they were good and true to each other, and they loved each other dearly. So, 20 minutes. I said 15, 20 minutes. That is the end of our first story, which leaves 2 stories. One is Mighty Mikko, and one is The Way of the World. Which is, the next one is about a fox, and has a lot of similarities to another story that we read, but I think I kind of prefer it. And then the last one is about a dragon. Specifically gives me a chance to talk a little bit about Norse conceptions of dragons, but not too much because that's not necessarily what this show is about, but it's a very distinctly Norse version of a dragon. It's the wrong water. GS says, bread's a tough task. Yes, it is. Yeah, they could collect the wheat, but how were they kneading that? They just kind of glossed over that part of the story. GS has great mouse voice, Rory. I never know. They sound terrible in my head. And then sometimes when I listen to them back, they either sound like I'm barely doing anything at all, the high voices, I mean, or they sound a lot better than they do in my head. They don't sound good to me, so it's a hard thing to estimate. And GS says, what a sweet, touching story. Yeah, I agree. I really enjoyed this story. It was fairly focused for a folktale. It didn't go off into like 9 different directions, which is actually pretty unusual. Okay. So this story is the namesake of the book it comes from. Again, we're reading stories that were all found in a book that I bought this weekend called Nordic Tales. And, you know what? I'll show you. Just give me a second. I want to show you the picture for this. Because it is my favorite picture, I think, in the book that I've found so far, anyways. It's a little fox talking to a king. Absolutely gorgeous. This is called Mighty Mikko, the story of a poor woodsman and the grateful fox. Points to you if that title alone tells you what story it's very similar to. So yeah, this is from the book Mighty Mikko, a book of Finnish fairy tales and folk tales. This is called Mighty Mikko. This is the namesake tale. There was once an old woodsman and a wife who had an only son named Mikko. As the mother lay dying, the young man wept bitterly. "When you are gone, my dear mother," he said, "there will be no one left to think of me." The poor woman comforted him as best she could and said to him, "You will still have your father." Shortly after the woman's death, the old man, too, though, was taken ill. "Now indeed I shall be left desolate and alone," Mikko thought, as he sat beside his father's bedside and saw him grow weaker and weaker. "My boy," the old man said just before he died, "I have nothing to leave you but the 3 snares which these many years I have caught wild animals. These snares now belong to you. When I am dead, go into the woods, and if you find a wild creature caught in any of them, free it gently and bring it home alive." After his father's death, Mikko remembered the snares and went out to the woods to see them. The first was empty, and also the second, but in the third he found a little red fox. He carefully lifted the spring that had shut down on one of the fox's feet, and then carried the little creature home in his arms. He shared his supper with it, and when he lay down to sleep, the fox curled up at his feet. They lived together for some time until they became close friends. "Mikko," said the fox one day, "why are you so sad?" "Because I'm lonely." "Pooh," said the fox. "There's no way for a young man to talk. You ought to get married. Then you wouldn't feel lonely." "Married?" Mikko repeated. "How can I get married? I can't marry a poor girl because I'm too poor myself, and a rich girl won't marry me." Nonsense, said the fox. You're a fine, well set-up young man. You're kind and gentle. What more could a princess ask? Mikko laughed to think of a princess wanting him for a husband. I mean what I say, the fox insisted. Take your own princess now. What would you think of marrying her? Mikko laughed louder than before. I've heard, he said, that she is the most beautiful princess in the world. Any man would be happy to marry her. Very well, the fox said. If you feel that way about her, then I'll arrange a wedding for you. With that, the little fox actually did trot off to the royal castle and gained audience with the king. My master sends you greetings, the fox said, and he begs you to loan him your bushel measure. So for those who don't know, a bushel is a measure of mostly wheat, is a big pot like this, usually made out of like brass or iron. Ugh. My bushel measure, the king repeated in surprise. Who is your master? And why does he want my bushel measure? Shh, the fox whispered, as though he didn't want the courtiers to hear what he was saying. And slipping up close to the king, he murmured in his ear, Surely you've heard of Mikko, haven't you? Mighty Mikko, as he's called. The king had never heard of any Mikko who was known as Mighty Mikko, but thinking that perhaps he should have heard of him, he shook his head and murmured, Mikko, Mighty Mikko, yes, oh, to be sure, yes, of course. My master is about to start off on a journey, and he needs a bushel measure for a very particular reason. I understand, the king said, although he didn't understand at all. He gave orders that the bushel measure which they used in the storeroom of the castle to be brought in and given to the fox. The fox carried off the measure, hid it in the woods. Then he scurried about to all sorts of little out-of-the-way nooks and crannies where people had hidden their savings in a time before banks. And he dug up a gold piece here and a silver piece there until he had a handful. Then he went back to the woods and stuck the various coins in the cracks of the pot, the bushel measure. The next day he returned to the king. My master, Mighty Mikko, he said, sends you thanks, O king, for the use of your bushel measure. The king held out his hand, and when the fox gave him the measure, he peeped inside to see if by chance it contained any trace of what had recently been measured. His eyes, of course, at once caught the glint of gold and silver coins lodged in the cracks. Ah, he said, thinking Mikko might be a very mighty lord indeed, to be so careless with his wealth. I should like to meet your master. Won't you and he come and visit me? This was what the fox wanted the king to say, but he pretended to hesitate. I thank you, Majesty, for the kind invitation, but I fear my master can't accept it just now. He wants to get married soon, and we are about to start off on a long journey to inspect a number of foreign princesses. This made the king all the more anxious to have Mikko visit him at once, for he thought that if Mikko should see his daughter before he saw those foreign princesses, he might fall in love with her and marry her. So he said to the fox, My dear fellow, I must prevail on your master to make me a visit before he starts out on his travels. You will, won't you? The fox looked this way and that, as if he were too embarrassed to speak. Your Majesty, he said at last, I pray you pardon my frankness. The truth is you are not rich enough to entertain my master, and your castle isn't big enough to house the immense retinue that always attends him. The king, who by this time was frantic to see Mikko, lost his head completely. My dear fox, he said, I'll give you anything in the world if you prevail upon your master to visit me at once. Couldn't you suggest to him to travel with a modest retinue this time? The fox shook his head. No. His rule is either travel with a great retinue or to go on foot disguised as a poor woodsman, attended only by me. Well, couldn't you prevail on him to come to me as disguised as a poor woodsman? The king begged. Once he was here, we could place gorgeous clothes at his disposal. Still, the fox shook his head. I fear, your majesty, his wardrobe doesn't contain the kind of clothes my master is accustomed to. I assure you I have some very good clothes, the king said. Come along this minute. We'll go through them, and I'm sure you'll find that something that your master will wear. So they went to a room which was like a big wardrobe with hundreds and hundreds of hooks, upon which were hung hundreds of coats and breeches and embroidered shirts. The king ordered his attendants to bring the costumes down one by one and place them before the fox. We'll do a little zoom on the picture here, and I'll take a drink of water. Water break. They began with the plainer clothes. Good enough for most people, the fox said, but not for my master. They took down garments of a finer grade. I'm afraid you're going to all this trouble for nothing, the fox said. Frankly now, don't you realize that my master couldn't possibly put on any of these things? The king, who would hope to keep for his own use his most gorgeous clothes of all, and now ordered these to be shown. The fox looked at them sideways, sniffed them critically, and at last said, well, perhaps my master would consent to wear these for a few days. Now, not what he's accustomed to wear, but I will say this for him. He is not proud. The king was overjoyed. Very well, my dear fox. I'll have the guest chambers put in readiness for your master's visit, and I'll have all these, my finest clothes, laid out for him. You won't disappoint me, will you? I'll do my best, the fox promised. With that, he bade the king a civil good day and ran home to Mikko. The next day, as the princess was peeping out of an upper window of the castle, she saw a young woodsman approaching, accompanied by a fox. He was a fine, stalwart youth, and the princess, who knew from the presence of the fox that he must be Mikko, gave a long sigh and confided to her serving maid, I think I could fall in love with that young man, if he really were only a woodsman. Later, when she saw him arrayed in her father's finest clothes, which looked so well on Mikko that no one recognized them as the king's, she lost her heart completely, and when Mikko was presented to her, she blushed and trembled just as an ordinary girl before a handsome young man. All the court was equally delighted with Mikko. The ladies went into ecstasies over his modest manners, his fine figure, the gorgeousness of his clothes, and the old gray-beard counselors, nodding their heads in approval, said to each other, Nothing of the coxcomb about this young fellow. In spite of his great wealth, see how politely he listens to us when he talks. The next day the fox went privately to the king and said, sorry, come on, there we go. Ugh, I don't know why my nose is so itchy. My master is a man of few words and quick judgment. He bids me to tell you that your daughter, the princess, pleases him mightily, and that, with your approval, you will make his addresses to her at once. The king was greatly agitated and began, "Oh, my dear fox," but the fox interrupted him to say, "Think the matter over carefully, and give me your decisions tomorrow." So the king consulted with the princess and with his counselors. In a short time, the marriage was arranged and the wedding ceremony actually performed. "Didn't I tell you?" said the fox when he and Mikko were alone after the wedding. "Yes," Mikko acknowledged. "You did promise that I should marry the princess. But tell me, now that I am married, what am I to do? I can't live on here forever with my wife." "Put your mind to rest," the fox said. "I've thought of everything. Just do as I tell you, and you'll have nothing to regret. Tonight, say to the king, 'It is now only fitting that you should visit me and see for yourself the sort of castle which your daughter is hereafter to be mistress.'" And so, when Mikko said this to the king was overjoyed, for now that the marriage had actually taken place, he was wondering whether he hadn't perhaps been a little hasty. Mikko's words reassured him, and he eagerly accepted the invitation. On the morrow, Fox said to Mikko, "Now I'll run ahead and get things ready for you." "But where are you going?" Mikko said, frightened at the thought of being deserted by his little friend. The fox drew Mikko aside and whispered softly, "A few days' march from here there is a very gorgeous castle belonging to a wicked old dragon who is known as the Worm. I think the Worm's castle would just about suit you." That's right, there's a dragon in this one too. Surprise! The last two stories both have dragons. Notice it's called the Worm. Lindworm is a Nordic thing for dragons, I think. Somebody tell me if I'm wrong about that, but I believe that is what it is. I'm sure it would, Mikko agreed, but how are we going to get it away from the worm? Trust me, the fox said. All you need to do is this. Lead the king and his courtiers along the main highway until by noon tomorrow you reach a crossroads. Turn there to the left and go straight on till you see the tower of the worm's castle. If you meet any men by the wayside, shepherds or the like, ask them whose men they are, and show no surprise at their answer. So now, dear master, farewell until we meet again at your beautiful castle. The little fox trotted off at a smart pace, and Mikko and the princess and the king, attended by the whole court, followed in a more leisurely fashion. The little fox, when he had left the main highway at the crossroads, soon met 10 woodsmen with axes over their shoulders. They were all dressed in blue smocks of the same cut. Good day, the fox said politely. Whose men are you? Our master is known as the Worm, the woodsman told him. My poor, poor lads, the fox said, shaking his head sadly. What's the matter? The woodsman asked. For a few moments the fox pretended to be too overcome with emotion to speak. Then he said, My poor lads, don't you know that the king is coming with a great force to destroy the worm and all his people? The woodsmen were simple fellows, and this news threw them into great consternation. Is there no way for us to escape? They asked. The fox put his paw to his head and thought. Well, he said at last, there is one way you might escape, and that is by telling everyone who asks you that you are the mighty Mikko's men. But if you value your lives, never again say that your master is the worm. We are mighty Mikko's men, the woodsman began repeating over and over. We are mighty Mikko's men! A little farther on the road, the fox met 20 grooms, dressed in the same blue smocks, who were tending 100 beautiful horses. Yeah, not 20 people marrying a bride, a groom like a groomer. The fox talked to the 20 grooms as he'd talked to the woodsman, and before he left, they too were shouting, "We are mighty Mikko's men!" Next, the fox came to a huge flock of 1,000 sheep tended by 30 shepherds, all dressed in the worm's blue smocks. He stopped and talked to them until he had them roaring out, "We are mighty Mikko's men!" Then the fox trotted on till he reached the castle of the worm. He found the worm himself inside, lolling lazily about. He was a huge dragon, and had been a great warrior in his day. In fact, his castle and his lands and his servants and his possessions all had been won in battle. But now, for many years, no one had cared to fight him, and he'd grown fat and lazy. I mean, me too, worm. "Good day," the fox said, pretending to be very breathless and frightened. "You are the worm, aren't you?" "Yes," the dragon said boastfully. "I am the great worm." The fox pretended to grow more agitated. "My poor fellow, I'm sorry for you. But of course none of us can expect to live forever. Well, I must hurry along. I thought I would just stop and say goodbye." Made uneasy by the fox's words, the worm cried out, "Wait a minute. What's the matter?" The fox was already at the door, but at the worm's entreaty he paused and said over his shoulder, "Why, my poor fellow, you surely know, don't you, that the king has a great force is coming to destroy you and all your people?" "What?" the worm gasped, turning a sickly green with fright. He knew he was fat and helpless and could never again fight, as in the years gone by. What a great premise, by the way, just to pause. I've never seen a fat, out-of-shape dragon worried about people fighting him in any story I've ever read, and it is an amazing premise. "Don't go just yet," he begged the fox. "When is the king coming?" "He's on the highway now. That's why I must be going. Goodbye." "My dear fox, stay just a moment, and I'll reward you richly. Help me to hide so that the king won't find me. What about the shed where the linen is stored? I could crawl under the linen, and then if you lock the door from the outside, the king could never find me." "Very well," the fox agreed, "but we must hurry." So they ran outside to the shed where the linen was kept, and the worm hid himself under the linen. It's a lot of linen. The fox locked the door and then set fire to the shed, and as soon there was nothing left of that wicked old dragon, the worm, but a handful of ashes. The fox now called together the dragon's household and talked them over to Mikko as he had the woodsmen, the grooms, and the shepherds. Meanwhile, the king and his party were slowly covering the ground over which the fox had sped so quickly. When they came to the 10 woodsmen in blue smocks, the king said, "I wonder whose woodsmen those are." One of his attendants asked the woodsmen, and 10 of them shouted at the top of their voices, "We are mighty Mikko's men." Mikko said nothing, and the king and all the court were impressed anew with his modesty. A little farther on, they met 20 grooms with their 100 prancing horses. When the grooms were questioned, they answered with a shout, "We are mighty Mikko's men." The fox certainly spoke the truth. The fox certainly spoke the truth, the king thought to himself, when he told me of Mikko's riches. A little later, the 30 shepherds, when they were questioned, made answer in a chorus that was deafening to hear, "We are mighty Mikko's men." The sight of the 1,000 sheep that belonged to his son-in-law made the king feel poor and humble in comparison, and the courtiers whispered among themselves, "For all his simple manner, mighty Mikko must be a richer, more powerful lord than the king himself. In fact, it is only a very great lord indeed who can ever be so simple. At last they reached the castle, which from the blue smocked shoulders that guarded the gateway they knew to be Mikko's. The fox came out to welcome the king's party, and behind him in 2 rows, all the household servants. These, at a signal from the fox, cried out in one voice, "We are mighty Mikko's men!" Then Mikko, in the same simple manner that he would have used in his father's mean little hut in the woods, bade the king and his followers welcome, and they all entered his castle, where they found a great feast already prepared and waiting. The king stayed on for several days, and the more he saw of Mikko, the better pleased he was that he had him for a son-in-law. And when he was leaving, he said to Mikko, "Your castle is so much grander than mine that I hesitate ever asking you back for a visit." But Mikko reassured the king by saying earnestly, "My dear father-in-law, when I first entered your castle, I thought it was the most beautiful castle in the world." The king was flattered, and the courtiers whispered among themselves, "How affable of him to say that when he knows very well how much grander his own castle is." And when the king and his followers were safely gone, the little red fox came to Mikko and said, "Now, my master, you have no reason to feel sad and lonely. You are lord of the most beautiful castle in the world. You have for wife a sweet, lovely princess. You have no longer any need of me, so I'm going to bid you farewell." Mikko thanked the little fox for all he had done, and the little fox trotted off to the woods. So you see, Mikko's poor old father, though he had no wealth to leave his son, was really the cause of Mikko's good fortune. Because he told Mikko in the first place to carry home alive anything he might have found caught in the snares. And I think this story really, that's the end, really emphasizes the idea that a lot of the talking animal stories are actually sort of recast or Christianized versions of pagan spirit stories, because this seems a lot more like a forest spirit helping him out than anything else. Holly's house says Rory's popular tonight, am I? I don't keep the viewer count open when I'm streaming, because as somebody, another streamer who I watched said, if it's really low, then you might feel bad about yourself, and if it's really high, then you might feel nervous. So there's really no gain. Holly's house says, I think I'm going to try this scam. Well, okay, does anybody recognize what structure of story this is pulling from? Because we've already read basically a very similar story that has a very similar structure, although I do like this one more. Points to whoever in chat first recognizes what story we already read that sounds this way. Okay, we are getting a little tighter on time than I thought we would, so I don't want to blow too much time. I'm just going to have a drink of water. The last story is a shorter story. It's about a dragon. It's called The Way of the World. We'll read it in just a second. Also, since we're having a moment here, just a reminder that on Thursdays at 6:30 we do the Varietal show, which is where we write stories live. Take various forms. Some of them are quite silly. Some of them are more serious activities of actual writing exercises I do. Kind of depends what I feel like that week. Some are straight up games. So if you enjoy like being a part of a creative process, even if it's just throwing in silly things to screw me up, Thursdays at 6:30, the Varietal show. Please come by and check it out. Okay. Well, I don't know if chat's caught up yet, but I will tell you right now. That story is basically Puss in Boots with a fox. But I do think I like it better. I like it better with a dragon in the castle than a troll, because trolls are generally pretty stupid. Dragons are usually analogies for tyrant kings. And that makes more sense for the kind of figure that we encounter in that Mighty Mikko story. Okay. This is from a different book, but still a part of the same collection that I recently purchased, but a part of an older collection. This is from the book Tales from Fjeld, a second series of popular tales. They're from all over, but they're mostly... they're from... Never mind. I'll say it later. This is Tales from the Fjeld. A second series of popular tales. The story is The Way of the World. Once on a time there was a man who went into the wood to cut hop poles, but he could find no trees so long and straight and slender as he wanted, till he came up, high up under a great heap of stones. There he heard groans and moans as though one were at death's door. So he went up to see who it was that needed help. And then he heard that the noise came from under a great flat stone which lay upon the heap. It was so heavy that it would have taken many men to lift it. But the man went down again into the wood and cut down a tree, which he turned into a lever. And with that he tilted up the stone, and lo, out from it crawled a dragon, and made at the man to swallow him up. But the man said he had saved the dragon's life, and it was shameful thanklessness in him to want to eat him up.
Maybe, said the dragon, but you might very well know I must be starved, and when I have been here hundreds of years and never tasted meat. Besides, it's the way of the world. That's how it pays its debts.
The man pleaded his cause stoutly and begged prettily for his life, and at last they agreed to take the first living thing that came for a daysman. And if his doom went the other way, the man should not lose his life, but if he said that the same as the dragon should eat the man. Now, I'm just going to clarify that paragraph because I didn't read it. I understand it the first time I read it. What they're saying is they are going to take the first person who comes along the road, ask them about their views basically on their life in the world. And if their experience reflects this idea that the world is kind of unfair and cruel that the dragon is proposing, then he will agree that that's the way the world is and be eaten. And if not, then the dragon has to let him go. That's the deal. The first thing that came was an old hound who ran along the road down below under the hillside. Him they spoke to and begged him to be judge. God knows, said the hound, I've served my master truly ever since I was a little whelp. I have watched and watched many a night through, while he lay warm asleep on his ear. And I have saved that house home from fire and thieves more than once. But now I can neither see nor hear any more, and he wants to shoot me. And so I must run away and slink from the house to house and beg for my living till I die of hunger. No, it's the way of the world, said the hound. That's how it pays its debts.
Now I'm coming to eat you up,
said the dragon, and tried to swallow the man again. But the man begged and prayed hard for his life, till they agreed to take the next comer for a judge. And if he said the same as the dragon and the hound, the dragon was to eat him and get a meal of man's meat. But if he did not say so, the man was to get off with his life. So there came an old horse, limping down the road, which ran under the hill. Him they called out to come and settle the dispute. Yes, he was quite ready to do that.
Now, I have served my master, said the horse. As long as I could draw or carry, I have slaved and striven till the sweat trickled from every hair. And I have worked till I've grown lame and halt and worn out with toil and age, and now I am fit for nothing. I am not worth my food, and so I am to have a bullet through me. He says, Nay, it's the way of the world. That's how the world pays its debts.
Well, now I'm coming to eat you,
said the dragon, who gaped wide and wanted to swallow the man, but he begged again, hard for his life. But the dragon said he must have a mouthful of the man's meats. He was so hungry he couldn't bear it any longer.
See yonder who comes, looks as if he was sent but to be a judge between us,
said the man as he pointed to Reynard the fox, who came stealing between the stones of the heap.
All good things are three, said the man. Let me ask him too, and if he gives doom like the others, eat me up on the spot.
Very well,
said the dragon. He too had heard all good things were three, and so it should be a bargain. So the man talked to the fox as he talked to the others. Yes, said Reynard. I see how it all is. But as he said this, he took the man a little on one side. What will you give me if I free you from the dragon? He whispered into the man's ear. You shall be free to come by my house, and to be lord and master of my hens and geese every Thursday night, said the man. Well, my dear dragon, this is a very hard nut to crack. I can't get it into my head how you, who are so big and mighty a beast, could find room to lie under yon stone.
Can't you?
Said the dragon.
Well, I lay under the hillside and sunned myself, and down came a landslip and hurled stone over me.
No, very likely, I dare say, said Reynard. But still, I can't understand it, and what's more, I won't believe it till I see it. So the man said they had better prove it, and the dragon crawled into the hole again, but in the twinkling of an eye, they whipped out the lever, and the stone went crashing down again on the dragon. Lie now there till doomsday, said the fox. You would eat the man, who saved your life? The dragon groaned and moaned and begged hard to come out, but the two went their way and left him alone. The very first Thursday night, Reynard came to the lord and master over the hen roost, and hid himself behind a great pile of wood hard by. And when the maid went to feed the fowls, in stole Reynard. She neither saw nor heard anything of him, but her back was scarce turned before he supped blood enough for a week, and stuffed himself so that he could not stir. So when she came in again in the morning, there Reynard lay and snored, and slept in the morning sun, with all four legs stretched straight. He was as sleek and round as a German sausage. Away ran the lassie for the goody, and she came, and all the lassies with her, with sticks and brooms to beat Reynard, and to tell the truth, they nearly banged the life out of him. And just as it was almost all over with him, and he thought his last hour was come, he found a hole in the floor, and so he crept out, and limped and hobbled off to the wood. Oh, said the Reynard, how true it is. 'Tis the way of the world, and this is how it pays its debts. And that's our last story of the night. GS says they always fall for those dares. Yes, pride and ego. Well, that's Fireside Fairytales. Our theme tonight was basically animals helping us out. I like the last one because it has a bit of a twist. We got to see two fox stories again. Like I said, there's nothing that seems to recur more often than the fox, and in particular the fox and the wolf. If you want to hear other fox and wolf stories, we have another episode completely dedicated to fox and wolves from Ukrainian folktales. It's not the Ukrainian folktale video, though. There's the Ukrainian folktale video, and the following week is one about the fox. That comes up in a lot of things. That's like an episode focused on it, but if you watch some of our old ones, I think our Swedish one in January, if I'm remembering correctly, also has one about a fox and a wolf. No, a bear. That's right. It's, I mentioned before that he's sort of a Bugs Bunny character, where he kind of loses and kind of wins, and he's always sort of running on his wits. And he's everywhere, literally all over the stories of the fox. GS says, jolly good stories tonight, Rory. Yeah, I really, I enjoyed telling these stories, and I enjoyed reading them. Again, if you want to find anything that we read, All of these are available in Project Gutenberg for free. You can read them on a webpage, or you can, if you have an e-reader, Project Gutenberg has EPUB and other files that work on e-readers. Anyways, this has been Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory. Like and subscribe if you've never been here before and you enjoyed it. That's one of the things you can do that helps us the most. The other thing you can do is let other people know if you enjoyed it. We're obviously very small, and we're up against a lot of things that I do enjoy, but I don't do, like video games and movies and stuff on YouTube. So if you enjoy some storytelling and you want to support us, like and subscribe and tell your friends. I'd really appreciate it. Other than that, at Varietal_lit on Instagram and Twitter, if you want to follow us there and keep up to date that way, or you can just follow us here. My name is Rory. This is Varietal Literature. You can check out some of our own stories that people like me have written on our website, and check us out next Thursday. This Thursday at 6:30, where we will be doing Varietal show and other such things. Or come back next Tuesday for another Fireside Fairytale. I'll keep the fire warm for you. If you guys just want to curl up and go to sleep, have a good night.